It's great to welcome back to the program today Dr. John Gartner, who is founder of Duty to Warn, co-editor of Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness, and the Mind of Donald Trump. As many in our audience may remember from the last time he was on, he taught in the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical Center for 28 years. John, great to have you back, first of all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
So listen, you and I have had over the last year a couple of conversations about what some perceive to be cognitive decline of the President of the United States. The term pre-dementia state has been used by you and other mental health professionals. This has become extraordinarily polarizing at this point, where you have part of the mental health community feeling very confident that the president is experiencing noticeable, marked cognitive decline, and that more needs to be done in order to examine that. And on the other side, you have individuals who believe that any mention of this is a conspiracy theory completely without merit or evidence. And it's really become polarizing even within certain aspects of the mental health community. So let's kind of take a step back.
Well,
first.
I have a question for those critics, okay? Is there any amount of evidence? Is there any fact or any clinical sign or any amount of evidence that would suggest to a rational, objective person that he is suffering from serious mental decline and needs to be evaluated? In other words, it seems like this is sort of a parallel to what's going on in the political world, right, with the Mueller report. It's like no matter how many facts you have, there are people who will spin it the other way, which then distracts you from an objective evaluation of the facts. This process about looking at his mental decline, as you say, began a year ago. So a year ago this time, a number of articles came out, one from Ford Vox, a neurologist, one from David Hamblin, a medical doctor who's an editor at The Atlantic, one from Sharon Begley and Stat, and all three of them made the same point a year ago, that they were noticing a noticeable decline when comparing Donald Trump to his own baseline. So and this is one of the most reliable indicators of organic mental deterioration, is when someone gets worse than their own normal functioning. They deteriorate from their own baseline. So they noticed deterioration in various formal factors. His vocabulary was diminished. The complexity of his sentences and his ability to complete a sentence was diminished. There's a paucity of thought. There was an increase in repetition and filler words, and repetition, and all of those are signs that someone might be cognitively declining from their earlier state. And we wrote a few op-eds about it, and we sent a letter to Ronnie Jackson asking him to do a neurological exam or screener, which he did. And at that point, Trump passed. And there was some debate about what did that mean that he passed. So it meant that he wasn't in a state of full-blown dementia because he could, for example, recognize a camel. He could repeat 3 numbers backward. He could draw a clock. It didn't mean that he wasn't in some state of pre-dementia or cognitive decline from his own baseline. But what we said at that time, what we predicted is if he really does have organic cognitive decline, it will get worse. That was the prediction. If our fears about the potential diagnosis were true, that he would deteriorate even further from that point. So now here we are 1 year later, and I'm here to report that he has deteriorated. He has gotten worse, to the point where now I think the question is not, does he have pre-dementia? I think the question is, does he have dementia? And if so, at what stage is it?
So in the op-ed that I published, in a second, I want to get to how we would evaluate that. But so to clarify and make sure we all understand what you're saying, individually, if someone repeats a word or type of word frequently, if someone misstates, for example, that their father was born in Germany when their father was born in the United States or whatever, individually, that in and of itself may not be notable. But when comparing Donald Trump now to Donald Trump 2, 5, and 20 years ago, for which there's significant audiovisual record, that's the comparison that you believe is particularly important to pay attention to.
Well, actually, that's what we said a year ago. I'm now saying something even more serious now. That if you say your father was born in Germany and it's your grandfather that was born in Germany, that is a sign of illness. That is something that we see in people who have dementia. So we have progressed beyond the point that Donald Trump is simply worse than his own baseline, to the point where he is now showing concrete signs of dementia itself. And let me give you some specific examples. One is what you just mentioned. So yes, he's had problems with memory. He's gotten people's names wrong very frequently. There are videos on this online. You can see we make fun of him for getting names wrong. Tim Apple was the one that was most recently in the news. But now we're seeing a level of deterioration of memory that's more clinical. For example, in Fire and Fury, it's reported that he seemed to not recognize old friends at Mar-a-Lago. And this symptom of saying that his father was born in Germany, he said it 3 times, when it's his grandfather that was born in Germany, that reminded me a lot of my uncle who recently died of Alzheimer's, that 2 months before he had to go into the nursing home, he was agitated one day and he cried out for me. He said, "Call John, he's a rich lawyer, he'll know what to do." Well, I'm not a lawyer. My father was a lawyer. So he confused me and my father, or he kind of mashed us into one person. So this mixing of the generations, or mixing people in your family into one person, that's something that we see clinically in people that are actually in a state of dementia and may even be unable to live independently and need to go to a nursing home. In other words, what I'm saying is, before, when we brought this issue up, we were talking about a decline from his own baseline. Now we're seeing signs of a more frank dementia, quite possibly. The other formal signs that we're seeing are something called paraphasias. So there's 2 types of paraphasias. One is called a semantic paraphasia, where you use the wrong word. For example, when he said, now we have to look into the oranges of the Mueller investigation,
right,
where it began from, the oranges of the investigation. He said it 3 times. And when he said where the investigation began, you could tell he was trying to modify the word oranges by clarifying, where it began, because he could tell he somehow vaguely knew he wasn't reaching the right word, but he didn't quite have an awareness that he didn't have the right word, if you know what I'm saying. So he needed to clarify what he meant by oranges, but he said it 3 times in a row. That's a semantic paraphasia, where you literally just use the wrong word for what you're trying to say. And then there's something called a phonetic paraphasia, where you use something that is not a word at all, not an English word whatsoever, but it's phonetically sounds like the word you're trying to say. So when he, for example, was introducing Benjamin Netanyahu, called him Betanyahu. He called peninsula. A lot of attention was given to when he was trying to say anonymous. He was saying animus, trying to say anonymous. He says capsicle for capsule. There's actually a great video online. Maybe you can show it later in the show, or people can go online and see it for themselves from The Daily Show. It's 2.5 minutes of these mispronunciations sort of strung together. And it's meant to be humorous, I guess, from The Daily Show, but it's actually quite clinically significant. What I'm trying to say is neurologically intact people don't do this. Period.
Yeah, what I've been saying,
don't do this.
What I've been making the point of is, I'm not a mental health professional nor a neurologist, although some people thought that I was a neurologist based on a very strange episode a year ago, but that's maybe a story for another day. I've been saying it wouldn't be funny. This wouldn't be funny, right? Like whatever the Daily Show is doing, we're not making fun of the possibility that someone is experiencing cognitive decline. If indeed this is what's going on, it needs to be taken seriously and it needs to be examined. And that's sort of the next question I have for you, which is that in your USA Today op-ed, you say identifying a llama or whatever it was and saying 3 numbers and identifying the city in which this test was administered, the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. That's not really what we need here. What is it that we need, and what would a proper assessment look like?
Right. If Donald Trump were your father, you would run, not walk to the neurologist for an evaluation. These kinds of really shocking signs would galvanize you to a state of emergency, basically, to bring him for a full-blown neuropsychological evaluation. And that's what we called for a year ago, and that's what we're calling for in this op-ed. But now it's really at an emergent level. It's not just he's kind of missing a step, or he's not what he used to be. No, now he's showing frank signs of dementia. I mean, this is like the emperor's new clothes. That's what I'm saying. Like, how much would he need to be babbling before people would acknowledge these aren't English words that he's speaking?
And what would a full-blown evaluation look like in practice? How long does it take? What sort of things are part of that?
Yeah, no, it takes several hours. It's a battery of tests. It's a very serious and thorough evaluation. And you would do nothing less for your relative. I mean, someone on Medicaid his doctor would make sure that they got approval for that kind of an evaluation if they were showing these kinds of serious signs and symptoms. So these are not just signs that he's deteriorated. These are actual clinical signs that are suggestive of, when people have phonetic paraphasias, that's considered a sign of the intermediate to severe stage of the illness.
And what else is, I mean, just for people who don't understand, what types of questions and tests and exams are part of this multi-hour examination? What do you ask the subject to do?
Well, well, first of all, I have to say I'm not a neuropsychologist, although I've done some neuropsychological research, so I don't administer these exams. But it is a battery of exams, and there's be a dozen different tasks you might ask them to do. But it's tasks having to do with memory, comprehension, vocabulary. It's fairly comprehensive. And by the way, we also see the dementia affects people in ways other than simply language. For example, there's some videotape that we've seen of him seeming to be disoriented and wandering. I think you've probably seen that videotape where he walks past his limo.
Yeah.
And people have to direct him back to the limo. There was a place when he was on stage in Poland. And he was just wandering around the stage as if he just didn't know why he was there. And people had to. I think he walked off stage. At one point they had to bring him back. This is the kind of thing that again, people who are neurologically intact don't wander. These are now starting to be like hardcore kinds of signs. Since I've written this, I've had maybe 30 or 40 or 50 people write me saying, "Oh my God, I'm seeing in Donald Trump signs that I saw in my mother or my wife or my father when he was dying of dementia." People even mention a kind of confused blank look on his face, which you may have noticed, seen that sometimes, where he just seems sort of like he doesn't know what's going on. Now, that's not something that you can quantify in a neurological exam, but it's one of those kind of like things that takes you aback and you go, whoa. When I've seen that look before, it's been in someone's face who has dementia. So all these people who have had personal experience, I've had geriatric nurses write me, I've had doctors write me who are gerontologists saying, this is what I deal with every single day of my life, and this is what I'm observing in the president.
And the last thing I want to touch on, a year ago you talked about what we might see in the next year if this goes in the direction you believe it may be going. What should we be looking for in the year to come? And of course, the trajectory for any individual can be different, whether or not you're talking about dementia, just as people age. But what would you be paying particular attention to?
Well, I think we're going to see further deterioration in his language. And in fact, there is a team of psychologists at University of Pittsburgh led by Mark Kutash that did a formal study of his verbalizations. And they found that over the last 7 years, he's increased in using sort of nonsense filler words like which is one of the indications of diminished neurological functioning. I'm actually going to be working with him, or at least talking about doing some more formal studies of his verbalizations so we can actually quantify these things in a more scientific way. His paper was a peer-reviewed journal that appeared in a psychological journal. So one thing is we will see more deterioration, but more deterioration in his memory, more disorientation, more nonsense words, more use of the wrong words, more deterioration in his train of thought. One of the things we see is that he used to speak in polished paragraphs. Now he can hardly finish a sentence without derailing into a non sequitur. It's something we call tangential speech. And tangential speech is also a sign of dementia. So we're going to see more fragmentation, more chaotic sort of crazy speeches where he just seems to veer from one irrelevancy to another. But here's the other thing. It also affects people's judgment, their impulsivity, their reality testing, and their sort of capacity to function in every respect. So what we have here is, we haven't even talked about his severe personality disorder, which is what we were talking about for the first 2 years. But now we have someone with a severe personality disorder who may also have dementia. This is literally the worst case scenario. If you were to invent the worst case scenario imaginable, it couldn't be worse than what we're talking about right now. Someone with a severe personality disorder who's now cognitively potentially becoming demented, who has the nuclear codes. There's absolutely no way that he has the capacity to, if this is the case, if it's what it appears to be, this is someone whose potential for making catastrophic errors is extremely high. So one of the manifestations might be just him doing something crazy and destructive that could kill millions of people.
We will be eagerly awaiting those studies that you are going to be working on, including the linguistic analysis. Dr. John Gartner, founder of Duty to Warn, co-editor of Rocket Man, taught in the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical Center for 28 years. John, always great to talk to you.
Yeah, always great to talk to you.